The haunted bloodline. Deep in the Appalachian mountains, where a fog-shrouded hollow lies, the wind whispers of forgotten sins. You've just pulled off a crumbling West Virginia road. As your tires crunch on the gravel, you spot it, an isolated cluster of shacks. Their windows are like empty eyes staring back. Shadows move within, figures twisted by blood and time. Among them is a child, barely 12, her belly swollen with a secret that binds the family tighter than any chains. This is no ghost story, it is real, etched into the genealogy of the Whitaker family, America's most haunted bloodline. A profound legacy of inbreeding warps both minds and bodies, concealing truths that society buried long ago. Dare to look closer, and you'll see the darkness lurking in the roots of our nation's hidden history. Hello everyone. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. Doing this ensures YouTube continues to show you stories just like this one. The Union of Blood. The Whitaker family story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet union of blood that should never have mixed, in the shadowed valleys of West Virginia, where coal mines scar the earth like old wounds. The story traces back to the late 19th century, when hardship and isolation marked the world into which identical twin brothers, Henry and John Whitaker, were born. These men, mirror images of one another, grew up in the rural backwoods, where clinging to family, sometimes too closely, was essential for survival. Henry married a local woman named Sally, and they raised a son named John Emery. Meanwhile, his twin, John, wed a woman named Rig, and they brought forth a daughter, Gracie Irene. In most other tales, this would have been a simple end, just ordinary branches on a family tree. However, fate, or perhaps desperation, twisted their paths. The twins' children, Gracie and John Emery, were double first cousins, sharing not just blood but an eerie genetic echo from their identical fathers. In 1937, they married, sealing a bond that blurred the lines between taboo and love. Their union resulted in 15 children, each one a living testament to the perils of inbreeding. The first, Eileen, arrived healthy enough, but as the brood grew, the shadows lengthened. Their second child, Emery Lee, tragically gasped his last breath from pneumonia just a month after birth, a fragile life snuffed out too soon. Then came Freddie, who later succumbed to a long illness, his body ravaged by unseen defects. Laureen, one of the daughters, gave birth to Timmy in 1979, a boy whose mind would forever wander in simplicity, yet whispers in the hollow spoke of darker currents beneath this surface. The festering secrets. Isolation bred not just genetic frailties but secrets that festered like untreated wounds. The family huddled in Odd, a village aptly named, where outsiders were rare and suspicion ran deep. John and Gracie's home became a fortress of silence, where the children's eyes held stories they couldn't voice. And amid this tangled web, allegations surfaced, hints of violations within the bloodline, where youth were stolen in the name of continuity. One account, buried in court records and hushed testimonies, points to a girl scarcely into her teens, bearing the burden of a pregnancy that shocked even the most jaded investigators. They say she was 12 when the cycle repeated itself, a child forced into motherhood by the very ties that should have offered her protection. This was more than just rumor. It echoed through the convictions of later generations, where grandsons like John Wade Jr. and Jason faced justice for assaults on the innocent, preying on girls as young as 13. The Whitaker bloodline, once a simple thread, had knotted into something monstrous. Genetic mutations manifested in fused eyelids, clefted palates, and minds trapped in eternal childhood. Ray, one of the brothers, communicates only in grunts and barks, his face a map of unspoken pain. Betty, the matriarch now, dedicated her life to shielding her siblings from the world's gaze, vowing never to marry. Yet, the past clings like mountain mist, refusing to dissipate. In Odd, time moves differently, with cycles of birth and decay repeating. Each generation is paying the price for their ancestors' choices. As historians sift through faded documents, they uncover a pattern, poverty driving families inward, where marriage outside the clan meant risking the unknown. But for the Whitakers, the cost was higher, lives stunted, potentials crushed under the weight of inherited flaws. Peeling back these layers reveals not just a family, but a microcosm of America's forgotten underbelly. The Appalachians hold many such tales, but none are as viscerally unsettling as this. What drove Henry and John to let their bloodlines entwine so fatally? Was it ignorance, or a deeper, primal urge to preserve purity at any cost? The answers lie buried in sealed records and unmarked graves, waiting for those brave enough to dig. A living cautionary tale. Remember, as we delve deeper, this isn't ancient history. The Whitakers live on, their story a living cautionary tale echoing through the hills like a warning from the past. The Whitaker family story doesn't end with John and Gracie's generation, it spirals further into the shadows. Each child became a new chapter in a book no one dared to read aloud. By the 1960s, their home in Odd, West Virginia, was more than a dwelling. It was a crucible where inbreeding and isolation forged lives marked by secrecy and struggle. The 15 children grew up in a world apart, where family was everything and the outside was a distant rumor. But this closeness came at a cost. Medical records, often scarce and incomplete, hint at congenital issues that plagued the brood. Skeletal anomalies, heart defects, and intellectual disabilities wove through their lineage like threads in a cursed tapestry. Betty, the eldest surviving daughter, became the family's anchor. Her fierce loyalty was a shield against prying eyes. Yet, even she couldn't protect them from the whispers of what happened behind closed doors. Among the siblings, Laureen stood out, not for her strength, but for her tragedy. At 18, she gave birth to Timmy, a boy whose developmental delays were evident early on. Whispers in Odd suggested his father was no stranger to the family, a claim that carried the weight of taboo. Laureen's life, like her mother's before her, was shaped by the expectations of a clan that turned inward to survive. But survival meant sacrifice. The children grew up in a haze of poverty. Their world was limited to the creaking walls of their shacks, and the Hollow's education was a luxury, replaced by the daily grind of existence. Some, like Larry and Ray, bore physical marks of their heritage, faces that seemed to carry the weight of generations, eyes that saw too much yet understood too little. The cycle of shame and silence. The community around them played a role in this seclusion. Odd was a place where secrets were currency, and the Whitakers were both feared and pitied. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the lies, about pregnancies that raised questions no one dared to answer, about children born too young. Court documents from the 1980s reveal a disturbing pattern, allegations of abuse and incest not just within the Whitaker home, but radiating outward. One case involved a granddaughter, barely a teenager, whose pregnancy sent shockwaves through the county. The father, a relative, was convicted, but the damage was done, a child raising a child, her future stolen before it began. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a cycle that thrived in isolation, where shame silenced truth. What makes this tale so chilling is its persistence. The Whitakers didn't vanish into history, they endured, their bloodline a living paradox of ruin and resilience. Geneticists who've studied such cases point to inbreeding's brutal arithmetic. Each generation doubles the risk of recessive disorders, amplifying flaws until they scream through flesh and bone. For the Whitakers, this meant siblings whose lives were tethered to a family that both destroyed and loved them, children who could barely speak. The hills of West Virginia, with their brutality and beauty, became a prison of circumstance. And yet, the family pressed on. Their story is a dark mirror reflecting America's hidden corners, places where pride and poverty conspire to bury the truth. As we peel back another layer, the question lingers, how deep does this darkness run? And what does it say about the nation that let it fester? The living ghost story. By the 1980s, the Whitaker family saga had become a living ghost story, one that locals in Odd, West Virginia, rarely confronted but whispered about. The family's shacks, clustered like gravestones in the hollow, stood as silent witnesses to decades of intertwined bloodlines. The children of John and Gracie, now adults, carried the scars of their heritage, some in their minds, others in their bodies. Ray, with his wild gestures and grunts, seemed to embody the family's unspoken pain. His voice was trapped where words couldn't reach. Laureen, another sibling, bore the weight of her own tragedies, her eyes reflecting a life of quiet endurance. The family's isolation was not just physical, it was a wall built from a stubborn refusal to let the outside world in, along with shame and poverty. But the outside world was starting to notice. County officials and social workers, drawn by rumors of abuse and neglect, began circling closer. Reports from the era, buried in dusty archives, describe a household where chaos reigned. Children born to the Whitaker daughters often stayed within the clan, raised in a haze of confusion about who was cousin, sibling, or parent. One case, documented in a 1984 court filing, tells of a girl barely 12, pregnant by a relative. Her name was redacted to shield her from a world that had already failed her. The father, a Whitaker cousin, faced charges, but convictions did little to unravel the family's knotted ties. These were not anomalies. They were patterns woven into the fabric of a bloodline that had turned inward for too long. The genetic toll was undeniable. Doctors who examined the family noted conditions like microfil and severe developmental delays, traits that appeared with chilling frequency. Each child born to the Whitakers carried a higher risk of inheriting recessive disorders, their DNA a ticking time bomb of ancestral choices. Yet, the family's loyalty to one another was fierce, almost primal. Betty, now the de facto matriarch, guarded her siblings like a sentinel, deflecting questions from outsiders with a steely gaze. To her, they were family, broken, flawed, but hers, even though she knew the world saw them as freaks, a curiosity to be gawked at. This loyalty, however, couldn't shield them from the truth, their bloodline was a labyrinth with no exit. What's most haunting is how this story mirrors America's hidden fractures. The Whitakers were a symptom of a nation that often ignores its most vulnerable. Systemic neglect, lack of education, and rural poverty created the conditions for this tragedy to unfold. The hills of West Virginia, with their desolation and beauty, became a crucible where the worst of human instincts could fester unchecked. As we dig deeper, the question isn't just about the Whitakers. It's about what their story reveals about the shadows we all inherit, the ones we pretend don't exist. The mythic quality. By the 1990s, the Whitaker family story had taken on a mythic quality in Odd, West Virginia, a tale told in barrooms and in hushed tones around campfires. The family's shacks, weathered by neglect and time, stood as relics of a past that refused to stay buried. The surviving siblings, Ree, Laureen, Betty, and others, lived in a world that had grown tighter, smaller, as if the hills themselves were closing in. Their lives were a paradox, bound by love, yet fractured by the consequences of their bloodline. The outside world, now more connected than ever, began to cast a harsher light on their existence. Curious journalists and documentarians ventured into the hollow, drawn by rumors of a family unlike any other. Their cameras captured faces that told stories of both ruin and resilience. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The Whitaker children, now adults, were a living gallery of inbreeding's toll. Timmy, Laureen's son, moved through life with a childlike simplicity, his understanding limited and his speech halting. Ray, unable to form words, communicated through guttural sounds, his eyes wild with emotions he couldn't express. Medical evaluations, though rare, painted a grim picture. Cognitive impairments that left some siblings dependent on Betty's care, skeletal deformities, and congenital heart issues. The family's isolation had trapped them in a cycle of dysfunction and dependency, even as it preserved them in a way. Social services, overwhelmed and underfunded, made sporadic visits, but interventions were fleeting. Their way of life was too deeply rooted, the Whitakers too entrenched, to be easily untangled. What chilled investigators most was the persistence of the family's darker secrets. Court records from the decade reveal more allegations of abuse, with names like Jason Whitaker and John Wade Jr. appearing in charges of sexual assault against minors. One case buried in a 1992 docket described a girl just 13, pregnant by a family member, her trauma was laid bare in clinical prose, though her identity was shielded. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the inevitable fruit of a bloodline that had collapsed inward, where boundaries of kinship blurred into something grotesque. The community, complicit in its silence, turned away, leaving the Whitakers to their fate. Yet, there was humanity here, too, in the fleeting moments of laughter captured by outsiders' lenses, in the way Betty held her family together. The Whitakers weren't monsters. They were people caught in a web spun by ignorance, poverty, and a history that offered no escape. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's margins, places where cycles of trauma perpetuate themselves in silence, where help rarely reaches. As we peel back this layer, the question isn't just about the Whitakers' sins. It's about the society that let them fester, watching from a distance as a family drowned in its own blood. The New Millennium. As the new millennium dawned, the Whitaker family story began to spill beyond the confines of odd, West Virginia, carried by the internet's unblinking eye. Their shacks, now crumbling under the weight of decades, became a grim pilgrimage site for those drawn to the macabre. Amateur documentaries and YouTube videos spread their tale, framing them as both curiosities and victims. Betty, now in her later years, remained the family's stoic guardian. Her weathered face was a mask hiding a lifetime of burdens. Her siblings, Timmy, Laureen, Ray, and others, lived in a world that felt frozen in time. Their daily routines were unchanged, even as the world's gaze sharpened. The Whitakers had become a symbol not just of inbreeding's horrors but of a nation's failure to confront its own shadows. The genetic consequences were now undeniable, etched into the family's very bodies. Siblings like Larry, with his fused eyelids, and Ray, with his wordless cries, were living proof of what happens when bloodlines loop too tightly. Geneticists studying cases like the Whitakers describe a phenomenon called inbreeding depression, where recessive genes pile up, manifesting as mental and physical frailties. The family's medical records, though patchy, note conditions like epilepsy and severe developmental delays, some so profound that basic communication was a struggle. Yet, in rare moments captured by outsiders, there was a flicker of joy, a laugh over a shared memory, a shared cigarette, that reminded the world these were people, not just a case study. The darker truths, though, refused to stay buried. Whispers of abuse persisted, with allegations surfacing as late as the 2000s. One chilling account, tucked away in a local newspaper archive, spoke of a young Whitaker girl, barely into her teens, pregnant under circumstances that pointed to a relative. The case echoed earlier tragedies, a grim reminder that the family's isolation enabled cycles of harm, not just preserving their bloodline. Legal interventions came and went, but the Whitakers' insularity made change nearly impossible. Betty's fierce protectiveness, while admirable, often shielded the guilty as much as the innocent, perpetuating a legacy of silence. This story's power lies in its ability to unsettle, to force us to look at the edges of society where help rarely reaches. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were a warning, a mirror reflecting the cost of ignorance, poverty, and neglect. Their lives, shaped by choices made generations ago, ask us to consider what we owe those trapped in cycles not of their making. As we near the end of this tale, the question looms, can a bloodline so broken ever find redemption? Or is it doomed to echo its own tragedies forever? The lingering echoes. The Whitaker family story, as it stands today, is a haunting echo that refuses to fade, carried forward by the few who remain in odd, West Virginia. The shacks, now barely standing, are like the bones of a past that clings to the present. Betty, the unwavering matriarch, has grown frail, her life spent holding together a family fractured by its own blood. Timmy, Laureen, and Ree, among the last of their generation, live in a world that's both trapped and timeless, surrounded by the same hills that cradled their ancestors' sins. The internet has made them infamous, their faces dissected by strangers who see them as a spectacle rather than a tragedy, splashed across screens. Yet, there's a quiet defiance in their daily lives, a refusal to be defined solely by their pain. The genetic legacy of the Whitakers is a textbook case of inbreeding's long shadow. Scientists point to their story as a stark illustration of how isolated communities, cut off from resources, can spiral into biological ruin. Conditions like profound developmental delays, cleft palates, and congenital heart defects aren't just medical notes. They're the visible scars of a bloodline that looped too tightly for too long. The family's isolation, once a shield against a judgmental world, became a prison, locking them into cycles of dysfunction and poverty. And yet, a flicker of humanity endures. Moments of tenderness, like Timmy's childlike smile or Betty's fierce care for her siblings, remind us these are people, not just a cautionary tale. The darker threads of their story, allegations of abuse, of children born to children, persist in Odd's collective memory. Court records, though sparse, hint at incidents as recent as the 2010s, where the family's insularity allowed harm to fester unchecked. These aren't just stories of the past. They're wounds that never fully healed, passed down like an inheritance no one wanted. The community, complicit in its silence, shares the blame, as does a society that left rural Appalachia to fend for itself. The Whitaker's tale forces us to ask how many other families, hidden in America's forgotten corners, are trapped in similar cycles, unassisted and unseen. This story doesn't end with answers, but with questions that linger like mist in the hollows. What does it mean to be human when your bloodline betrays you? What does it say about a nation that lets its tunnels of despair widen, generation after generation? The Whitakers, living relics of a buried truth, challenge us to confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. Their story, raw and unsettling, is a mirror held up to America's past, a past that still whispers in the hills of West Virginia, waiting for those brave enough to listen. Conclusion. You've journeyed with us through the Whitaker family's haunting tale, peeling back layers of a bloodline twisted by time and circumstance. Their story, buried in the hollows of Odd, West Virginia, isn't just a family's tragedy. It's a mirror to America's forgotten corners, where isolation and poverty breed secrets too heavy to carry. The shacks still stand, crumbling sentinels of a past that clings to the present, whispering of lives warped by choices made generations ago, of children born too soon. Betty's unwavering loyalty, Ray's wordless cries, and the chilling accounts of girls as young as 12 bearing the weight of their kin's sins, these are the threads of a tapestry no one was meant to see. This isn't a story that ends neatly, tied up with redemption or answers. The Whitakers live on, their lives a quiet defiance against a world that exploits and shuns them. Their bloodline, scarred by inbreeding, carries the weight of congenital defects, cleft palates, heart issues, minds locked in eternal childhood. Yet, a humanity that refuses to be erased is present in their shared moments of tenderness and their laughter. The allegations of abuse, documented through decades in court records, point to a darker truth. Isolation doesn't just preserve, it destroys, enabling cycles of harm that no one fully stopped. The girl pregnant at 12 wasn't just a victim of her family. She was a casualty of a society that looked away. What does this tale ask of us? To question what we owe those trapped in cycles of despair. To confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. The Whitakers aren't just a family. They're a warning etched in flesh and bone, a reminder that neglect festers where help doesn't reach. Appalachia's hills hold countless stories like theirs, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. As you leave this story, carry its weight with you. Ask yourself, what happens when a nation forgets its own? What other truths lie buried, waiting to be unearthed? Before you go, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment. Tell us what this tale stirred in you and where you're watching from. The Whitaker family's echoes linger, and so do the questions they leave behind. Until next time, keep searching for the truths hidden in the shadows.